This video is brought to you by Comixology.com. Actually, Comixology.com doesn't sponsor this. But it is thanks to Comixology that I found out that The Old Guard, which is a big hit on Netflix right now, starring Charlize Theron, was actually based on a comic by Greg Rucka, one of my favorite writers. So for today's episode of Anchor's Points, we're going to be reviewing the trade paperback for The Old Guard by Greg Rucka. Welcome to another episode of Anchor's Points. I am Anchor Pete. On Twitter, a whopping 3 of you voted on my poll and decided to voted on my poll. On Twitter, I put up a poll, and a whopping 3 of you voted for me to cover the first issue of Death Metal, the new DC Comics event. But that was before I saw that The Old Guard was based on a comic book by Greg Rucka. And so you know what? I have to cover it because my next thing I'm going to cover is going to be the movie The Old Guard. I'm going to watch that tonight. So, let's talk about The Old Guard. The first issue of The Old Guard was released in February of 2017 by Image Comics. It was written by Greg Rucka and illustrated by Leandro Fernandez. The first trade paperback, entitled Opening Fire, collects issues 1 through 5 of the book. In Opening Fire, we are introduced to a small group of mercenaries who have been brought together over the years based upon the fact that they cannot die. Shoot them, stab them, blow them up, they heal up and are ready for more. The leader of the mercenary group is Andy, short for Andromache. I don't know. It's spelled Andromache. Andy spends her endless days and nights with physical pleasures to drown out the fact that she cannot die, and that she can't experience love or deeper emotions, because those that she loves will eventually grow old and die. The world is getting smaller, Andy thinks to herself, as technology becomes more and more advanced. Keeping her immortality a secret from the rest of the world is becoming more and more difficult. In the beginning of Book 1, Andy and her team take on a mission that involves rescuing kidnapped children. The warning signs of a betrayal are there for the reader, but not clearly enough for Andy and her crew, and they are set up. As they deal with the repercussions of the setup, another immortal is awakened. Her name is Nile, and before she realized she was an immortal, she was killed in the line of duty. Waking up in a military hospital without a scratch on her, Nile seeks out answers. Andy has to decide whether to bring Nile into the fold or leave her alone in the world. At the same time, she and her team of immortal mercenaries are being hunted. I've been a fan of Greg Rucka since I got back into comics in the early 2000s. In future episodes, I need to cover other original Greg Rucka works, like Queen and Country and Lazarus. It is amazing that he is getting this attention due to the success of the Old Guard film, but he has created many character-driven, super intense thrillers that you need to read. Rucka has led the way in developing strong, realistic female characters. Dex Parios of Stumptown, which has been adapted to a TV series on ABC, she's played by Coby Smulders. Tara Chase of his comic Queen and Country, and Forever Carlyle of his sci-fi-inspired comic Lazarus, are only a handful of examples of his fleshed-out, flawed, intimidating female characters. If you are watching this video on the day that it premiered, or a day or two later, I strongly recommend heading over to Comixology.com. Right now, they have a sale on the Old Guard book, and they also have thrown in issues of Lazarus. It is an incredible deal, and if you end up watching the Old Guard movie and enjoying it, you're going to thoroughly enjoy both of those books. I've reached out to Greg Rucka to see if he'd be interested in being interviewed for this channel. So far, he hasn't written back. If I did get a chance to interview Greg Rucka, I would ask him, what was the inspiration for the Old Guard? There's definitely a Highlander vibe going on. I watched like an interview or two with Greg Rucka about the Old Guard before I made this video. And he was saying that there's many, many stories about immortals, and there's been stories about immortals going back since basically the time that stories began. We all would love to be immortal. We'd all love to live forever so that we could see what big changes are going to happen in the future, right? And we don't want to die. That is pretty much the guiding point of the book. There is a bad guy that wants to get the immortality that the main characters have, and not all the main characters that are on Andy's Strike Force team want to be immortal, including Andy herself. Now, we might have seen this idea before in other forms of literature, maybe books about old vampires like in Anne Rice books, or in stories like the aforementioned Highlander, or even in a comedic way with movies like Happy Death Day or Groundhog Day, where the main characters can't die. So we see that there's main characters that their very nature makes them contrary to how we feel. Of course, we would love to live forever, to be young and have our vitality forever. But these characters have had it, and they prove to us that maybe it's not what we would wish for. Right there, that alone makes The Old Guard a very interesting book. There was one theme that I've seen repeated in a lot of writing videos that I've watched recently, where the writer that was giving advice said, all stories have been told. You're not going to create this brand new original idea. And the idea of there being an immortal character that doesn't want to live anymore, that's not an original idea. And in those writing advice videos, the author giving the advice would say, you have to put your own individual spin on it. And so here's the thing, with Greg Rucka, he does have this individual spin that he puts on all of his stories. I personally would like to interview him because, to me, he has such a knowledge of espionage and crime and the military. You can tell that he has thoroughly researched each of those subjects. Even, for example, the Strike Force team that's made up of immortals that Andy is in charge of, that team, they talk in such a way that they sound like they've pulled off various mercenary missions. They talk as if they've lived in different countries and they know how the authorities are going to respond in certain countries. They talk as if they know what's going to happen if little kids get kidnapped in this country by a certain type of man. So it's this talking with this knowledge of the world, and it's the world of espionage and international crime and mercenaryism. That's a term, right? Mercenaryism? Mercenism? It always seems realistic. And to me, my life is so far removed from anything even remotely like that. So when I read something that's written about that type of world, like in Rucka's Queen and Country, or in this book, for example, to me, it's so exciting. And it can be done poorly. There are certain writers that like to write in that genre, but they're so melodramatic. And usually when they write about a male lead character, and he's usually just such a badass, and he's just like, he's like James Bond, basically, and he's so suave. But for Rucka, he almost always writes about female lead characters. And like I said before, they're very realistic. They remind me of women that I've met, and they are not completely without feminine attributes. A lot of times when you have a female action star, it just is like a man, but basically they're just like, oh, let's just change their name and just make it a woman, but it's just really a man. That's not the case. And to me, that's very realistic, because if we're operating on that level of espionage, or we're dealing with people that are mercenaries, I think that if there's a woman mercenary, if there is a woman that is a member of the CIA, if there is a woman soldier, if she's there, she's wanted to be there, and her whole life has led up to her being there. And so she's going to know what she's talking about. She's going to know how to respond to certain situations. And Rucka just does a phenomenal job writing these characters. So this comic reminds me of the movie Highlander, and also Anne Rice comic books, in which you have a story that takes place in the modern day, but then there'll be flashbacks to past lives of the immortal characters, and there'll be people that they interacted with in different centuries, and they lived through different times in history. And the stories that we face, whether it is Napoleon's army trying to invade Russia, or battles that take place during the Crusades, or even following a story that takes place in the time of slavery in the United States, but then eventually ends up in Australia, in the outback, during that same time period. It's just great to have these historical moments, these historical beats that are flashbacks to the main story. And once again, just the way that Rucka narrates these flashbacks, you can see that he's done a lot of research and he knows what he's talking about. When he's talking about Napoleon invading Russia, he's explaining how that dynamic worked and how the Russian people reacted. And when he's talking about a man who was a slave who then fought with the British during the Revolutionary War and then eventually made his way to Australia, you could just tell that Rucker knows what he's talking about. And it's to me, I love those little flashbacks because it's just this little nugget of history that you might not have known about unless you sought it out independently. But it's wrapped in this espionage thriller that has this fantasy overtone to it. These character flashback scenes are all character development. You know, it's great. Hey, let's set something during the Crusades, but it leads into why characters in the modern day act a certain way. So I just think I love stories like this because you have character developing moments taking place in historical times, which just by their very nature are intriguing. So let's talk about the action. I'm assuming that the action in the Old Guard movie is going to be over the top. I've heard a lot of people compare it to John Wick, and I'm pretty excited about that. When you have immortal characters who can get shot right in the chest and then they just get up 2 seconds later, you know that the action is just going to be over the top and ridiculous. I mean, there's characters that are just running at people that have machine guns. There's people jumping out of skyscrapers. You know, there's all kinds of crazy violence in this book as well. And it's fun. You have to admit that, like, knowing that the characters are immortal, there doesn't seem to be this, there's not as much of a consequence. It's kind of like when you read stories about Wolverine, you know that Wolverine can heal and you can pretty much do anything to him. So you have to work around that. You have to make that intriguing. And I think that, I don't want to go into any spoilers, but I think that what Rucka includes to make there be tension and to make there be stakes is very interesting, and it's a good route to take. Because you can't just kill the characters. There's not the threat of death, so there has to be other threats. So overall, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. So that brings us up to the Clemmy scale for this book. What do you think it's going to be? Yeah, it's going to be 5 Clemmys. So I've already given you a little sneak into the next episode. The next episode is going to be about the Old Guard Netflix movie, which I'm going to go watch tonight. In the comments, please, I want to know 2 things. I want to know, first, have you or will you watch the Old Guard movie on Netflix? And the other thing is, based on this review and based on that movie, do you think you might get the Old Guard comic? Thank you so much for watching. Please stay safe.